Good morning. This is the December 1st, 2012 meetup of the Austin Philosophy Discussion Group. I'm Jon Roland, and the lecture today is on constitutional philosophy. This is number 3 in the series. The first 2 lectures, number 1 and number 2, are online on YouTube, and I've sent links to the list of this group so that you can go and review it online. Also, you'll find there links to the PowerPoint presentations that I use in this presentation. Okay. We're going to get into some basics here, which have been glossed over in the previous lectures. This all may seem all too familiar to you, but it deserves some further reflection because it has some profound implications for moral philosophy. The law of agency is a basic unwritten law, although it has written codification in recent centuries, which relate to the relationship between principles and agents. Under the law of agency, there's a principal who selects an agent to whom he delegates powers and issues instructions and holds accountable and corrects or removes the agent if power is exceeded. And if he fails to do so, he becomes liable for the actions of the agent. This law arises from the constitution of society. It is not a creation of government or statute. It precedes all government and is generally shared by all human governments and human societies. Then we have to ask, what is a power? In this context, it is generally an expenditure of some scarce resource. And when it's applied to people, as it usually is, it's coercive. In other words, it gets them to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. Now, the coercion may be very gentle. It may be something they all want to do anyway, but need the little extra pressure from outside to make sure that everybody does it. So it is meaningful to distinguish between action and inaction, between the exercise and the non-exercise of a power. And non-delegation, the lack of delegation of power, is a decision not to act. No decision is a decision, but it can be not to expend or coerce and to accept the consequences. And a Republican Constitution presumes non-authority to act and a right to such presumption. Now, of late, that is becoming controversial, but historically and in all legal theory that anyone will admit to, that is the case. Then we get into the notion of a trust. A trust is a kind of agency. It's an agency with 3 actors. First is a settler. The settler is the principal. He's the one who creates the trust. The trustee is his agent, who administers the trust and its assets. The beneficiary is the party to whom is supposed to benefit the operations of the trustee. Each is a distinct legal person in law. This is an important distinction. Every individual will typically be multiple persons. A person in law is a role. Don't confuse it with an individual. An individual can be many persons. All of us are at least 2, a public and a private, and we may also assume such distinct persons as employer, lessor, trustee, official, husband, child. All of these are distinct persons with their own distinct obligations and rights. So they can be combined into one individual. A deacon of a church may be a corporation sole, a one-man corporation, essentially a trustee. His personal assets are distinct from and separate from the assets of the church, whom he administers. So if somebody gets a judgment against him individually, they can't attach the property of the church and vice versa. So the property of each, the assets of each, are kept separate. And the judgment must keep property separate. Now, a corporation is a special kind of trust. It can be for-profit or non-profit. But it's a kind of trust with multiple settlers, the incorporators, multiple trustees, the directors, and multiple beneficiaries, the shareholders or members, with procedures for the succession of each. So all the individuals that play those roles can all be replaced by other individuals while the entire structure continues. So the corporation outlives its individuals, or can. But it has its own assets separate from the actors above, and it's a legal person recognized by law, but not, strictly speaking, created by it. Now you hear a lot of lawyers saying, no, government or law creates corporations. That is not quite correct. Incorporators create corporations. They've been doing so since long before there were governments. What a government and law can do is recognize a monopoly in the use of a name. And it can allow the corporation to appear in court to pursue cases there. Although there is not supposed to be a reason for excluding it as long as it was properly incorporated. Government is a corporation. A republic is supposed to be a non-profit. A monarchy or an oligarchy tends to be for-profit, where some benefit at the expense of others, using politics to bypass the marketplace. And this is discussed in public choice theory. Remember, public choice theory concerns situations in which those with the greatest stake in the way public decisions are made invest the most in influencing those public decisions, usually with some success as a result, and the vast majority of people not having a sufficient stake in the outcomes to make the investment are often left with little or no influence on the way decisions are made. But we can say that the oligarchs or their supporters are rent seekers. That means essentially people who seek benefits from the political process instead of from the marketplace. And the only known solution is sortition, that selection of officials by lot. Now, one can argue that could be worth another lecture or two, but through all my study of history and law, I have never found another example, another kind of remedy. Today's sortition is found in our system of law mainly in juries. Juries are selected by sortition, or they're supposed to be. And that provides a way of getting a representative sample of the community into a situation where they're freed from distractions and directed to focus on a question that they're presented and to deliberate on that question. Whereas if you had something like direct decision making by the entire public, well, the entire public could be considered to be in a deliberative state all the time, but they're not really organizing their deliberations in a way that it can allow better ideas to percolate to the top, at least not as systematically. Morality in government then becomes an issue. Most moral philosophy discusses the morality of individuals in their private relations with other individuals. But Machiavelli discussed the problem that it's often not possible to reconcile personal morality with the needs of government and society. So you might be a great statesman, but you're going to go to hell. But that's okay, because maybe there's a special exemption if you've done the best you could in a difficult situation. Sometimes we must do evil to some to protect others. So sometimes we have to sacrifice some beneficiaries in order to protect other beneficiaries, which can create equity issues of its own. Or, of course, to protect those in power or their policies. Now, those could be good policies on the whole. They're not necessarily evil, just because evil is done to protect them. But it does conflict in the interpretation of powers, because we get all kinds of interpretive conflicts that arise from this kind of situation. Easy situation, one principal, one agent. The principal and the agent are each one individual. Disputes on interpretation are easy. The principal decides and instructs and can change the power from one day to the next. If the agent disagrees, he can resign. Or the principal can fire the agent, get another one. The main issues may come in if the agent is owed money for his actions or is penalized for his actions. If the action was unauthorized, the principal doesn't have to pay him. But what happens if we have multiple principals, which is typically the case in a society and its government? The principals may disagree on the interpretation of powers. They may agree to all delegate some power to an agent, and then they say, well, wait a minute, that's not what I meant by that. So even if they agree on basic things like structure and procedure, or if they trust one another, because successors may not understand or comply if there are ambiguities, but substantial consensus is required on the scope of powers delegated. If there's a distinction between, an importance between ordinary operations and much more fundamental delegations of power. So, for example, so we can say it defaults to the breadth of power on which all but a few can agree. Let's say, for example, that three owners of an apartment complex who don't have a formal partnership agreement agree to, with a contract with a apartment manager, which stipulates that he shall see to it that the lawns are kept mowed. And then a couple of months later, he hits him with a bill. He's hired somebody to mow the lawns. And two of the three think that's okay, but one of the three says, now wait a minute, that's not the way I understood that clause. See to it means he's got to do it himself. It's part of his deal for 1 month for free rent and a commission on every apartment he leases. He doesn't have authority to hire anyone else to mow the lawns unless he's going to pay him himself. Now we say, well, wait a minute, we've got 2 against 1 here. That would seem to be a simple majority. Shouldn't the simple majority prevail? Not in this situation, because in general, even if a simple majority agrees on a broader scope for powers, if a significant minority disagrees, the default is what they all have in common. Remember the Venn diagrams I've used in previous lectures. What is included within the powers that is common to them all then becomes the stricter interpretation. So, we have decision rules. On less important matters, you can have a simple majority vote. But on more important, like the scope of powers, we need supermajorities or near consensus. Now, in the case of the U.S. Constitution, we had ratification with 9 states, which was about 3/4. But the supermajority supported strict construction of powers. Now, this is reflected in the amendment rules. 2/3 of the people through their representatives plus majorities in 3/4 of the states. So amendments were not to be done by simple majorities. If you wanted to change something in the basic rules, you needed a supermajority. That takes us to the problem of incidental powers. Early doctrine, which we inherited from England, was that power was to be literally and strictly interpreted. There was a legal maximum for that, potestas stricta interpretator. By 1776, Tory English doctrine allowed for delegated power to imply incidental powers. In other words, if you have the power to collect taxes, you have the power to open an office and hire personnel and print forms and issue notices and things like that. Incidental powers, without having to spell out that you had each of those powers. The necessary and proper clause of the U.S. Constitution was intended to delegate such incidental powers. We have that on the authority of the guys who wrote it, especially Madison. But that still left disagreement on the boundaries of what is incidental. There was a split in the common law that we inherited from England. Remember, originally, the legal system we inherited was mostly not codified in statutes. It was mostly a legacy of court decisions, court precedents, and commentaries by legal scholars. And what was called common law was simply those principles of law which were common to all jurisdictions, at least within England. But with the settlement of the New World, we had a lot of people out in the colonies who said, well, we're Englishmen. We have all the same rights as Englishmen. The court precedents that we establish here have to be considered part of the common law. But the colonial courts began to diverge from the English precedents. The most notable example of that was the Zinger trial. Zinger was tried for criminal libel for defaming a public official, and the jury acquitted him on the grounds that truth is a defense to libel. So in effect, they nullified the law, at least in the colonies. This was reported by Zinger in the collections of state trials published in England, which meant that you often couldn't get it in the colonies. But the English courts were loath to accept it. So we had a bifurcation, a split in the two common law traditions. And there were more cases in colonial courts which recognized the rights of Englishmen. We have the first such case on our website, constitution.org, which was an appeal in a probate case. And the successful appellant argued that the rules that should be applied were what he claimed because they were the rights of Englishmen, and he prevailed. So, but the English courts often did not recognize colonial rights of Englishmen. Remember the Declaration of Independence? Jefferson complained about people being hauled off to England, or sometimes to Nova Scotia, to be tried because the Crown couldn't get a win in American colonial courts. And the reason for that, because there was a split already apparent there over what were the rights of the parties and the powers of government. The pre-1776 authorities, and it's 1776 because that's when the two legal systems became legally separated, they fall mainly into two camps, not just one. A lot of legal scholars, I had a recent exchange with a friend of mine who is a prominent conservative constitutional scholar, Rob Nadelson, and he basically recognizes certain background positions in the law, but I've suggested to him that there are really two camps involved, and that he needs to distinguish between which camp the site is that he's referencing, because they don't necessarily agree with one another. The two camps were the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories generally favored broader interpretations of powers, and the Whigs favored stricter interpretation. Now, that doesn't mean that every individual justice always held the same position. A particular one might hold that one power should be interpreted broadly and another one interpreted strictly. But as a general rule, they tended to divide into these two camps. Now, that doesn't mean they disagreed about everything. They actually did agree about most things. But there were subtle differences that began to become more and more important, and particularly to the colonists. The court, the main judge leading the Tory camp was Lord Mansfield. The main one leading the Whig camp was Lord Camden. Now, Lord Mansfield did turn in some pretty good decisions. He's the one who ended slavery. He's the one who famously said, "Ruat justitia, fiat justitia, ruat coelum," meaning, "Let justice be done, though the heavens fall." So he could be kind of rigid, but he tended to disagree on things like the power of juries to hear arguments on the law. He tended to take the job of deciding the law away from juries. There had been some important cases, namely those of Lilburn and Bushell, where the jury flat out decided that it could and did judge the law and found for the defendant. So he was trying to back off from that. Lord Camden thought that was a good thing. And of course, so did the Americans. So the Revolutionary Americans were mostly Whigs, and the Constitution was essentially written as a Whig model. In other words, an ideal constitution of government from the Whig point of view. Now, besides the cases, we need to examine the commentators, many of whom, of course, were also judges. Well, both Blackstone and Coke were judges, who gathered together a lot of cases, summarized them, and those became a more manageable way for lawyers to acquire the legal background that they had to operate in. Cook came first, did much of his work around 1628, give or take. Blackstone was about more than a century later, but his work was more accessible. Cook wrote a large set of books, multiple volumes called the Institutes, the Reports, and so forth, which were written in a language that was already becoming difficult to understand by lawyers in the 18th century. Blackstone was 4 volumes, so he boiled it down quite a bit. Of course, in boiling it down, he also got some of the sites wrong, and in the view of some, misinterpreted some of the precedents, so that became a source of contention in itself. England trended Tory, leading to abuses that provoked the American Revolution. Most of the things that the colonists complained about and fought a revolution over were essentially deviations from the common law standard that it was built around strict interpretation. So, but the Tory thought was carried forward into the United States by Hamilton and Marshall, John Marshall, the first Supreme Court Justice. So Hamilton, of course, died in a duel, but Marshall was still in place, and he held sway over the Supreme Court for many decades thereafter, giving us all kinds of decisions that, in the view of some, we were wrongly decided. Whig thought was carried by Jefferson, Madison, and their friends. So the question is, with 2 different lines of authority, which should be given the greater weight in interpreting the Constitution? So we have the question, strict or broad? Again, repeating the principles exposed earlier, when principals disagree on the scope of delegated authority, they may ignore a small minority, unless that small minority can prevail in court. Okay, the system was intended to protect rights, but when it comes to broad decision making, those rights are not necessarily protected by the political process. So we have a judicial process that can allow an individual or a small minority to prevail over a majority if their rights are clearly violated. But it may not ignore a substantial minority, say more than 1/3 of the people or majorities in more than 1/4 of the states. Well, why is that? That's not written in the Constitution. It's, in my view, implied by the procedure required for amending the Constitution. But it's also the practical effect that if you want people to get along with one another, you don't want to stomp on minorities too much, because you need their support in order to get things done. So the result is that you need, for important decisions, to strive for consensus and not just for a bare majority. So from our rule, constitutional powers must be interpreted no more broadly than 1/3 of the people or majorities in more than 1/4 of the states in 1787 would tolerate. And deviation from this rule can bring civil conflict.
When you say our rule, who is our?
Mine.
Okay,
All right. I'm including all of us in we here. Okay. The records of ratification are incomplete. We have a rough transcript of the Philadelphia Convention as courtesy of Madison, although it omits some parts of it where he wasn't was out of the room or busy doing committee work. There were not in general transcripts made of all of the state ratifying conventions. We do have them for a few states, and those are important. But almost all the states demanded and proposed amendments. They said, in effect, look, we'll ratify it, but we want certain changes made. So they were withholding their full consent pending amendments, which were boiled down by Madison and later by the two houses of Congress into the Bill of Rights. He started with about 19, and they boiled it down to 12, which 10 of which were adopted. Most of these proposed amendments were lumped together into the 9th and 10th Amendment. He considered it more important to keep the list short than comprehensive, and figured that for the rights in the 9th Amendment, you can just refer to the historical record. That hasn't proven to have worked out so well. No vote of the people was taken on how to interpret each provision. But we do have records of the public debate which show a very strong demand for strict construction of powers and broad for rights. And this takes just reading a lot of material. There's an excellent collection, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. I think it's almost 30 volumes now. Even I haven't read all of them, but I've come close. I've been missing a few volumes. You have to read a lot of that stuff in order to get the sense of what it is that the people felt and were thinking. And it's all there, letters and newspaper articles, and not just the anti-federalist papers of the Federalist, all kinds of stuff. Sermons, poems, all kinds of things. And there was this very distinct theme supporting my conclusion that they wanted strict construction of powers. Now, enough insisted on the Bill of Rights that there would have been no ratification without the promise of it. So the Federalists, that is to say those in favor of ratification, did not just win the ratification debates. The proponents won ratification, but the skeptics won on interpretation. In other words, they set a lower boundary on what kinds of interpretations. Now, if we're talking about powers, not necessarily structure or procedure, but of powers, they all had in common with the majority. Well, the debate continued. After the Constitution was ratified, we had the famous debates between Hamilton and Jefferson. That led to Congress adopting, with the support of President Adams, of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which Jefferson and Madison considered unconstitutional. It was caused so much controversy that in the election of 1800, the Federalists lost. The Jeffersonian faction, originally called Democratic Republicans and later Republicans, and still later Democrats, won the day. Jefferson himself was elected by a whisker. It was a tie going in, and Aaron Burr caved finally. He was the guy, remember, who shot Hamilton, and later tried to stage a revolution of his own in the Mississippi Valley. Well, he let Jefferson have it, and we can thank him for that. Anyway, this same debate continues to this day between advocates of broader governmental power and advocates of more narrow governmental power. So, the concept of republic, and this was a word used by the founders and has been used by the founders of other countries, has as its design principle the protection of rights. So it's not just majoritarian. Majority may be necessary to approve public action, but it's not sufficient. It may be blocked by a minority, especially if it infringes on rights. You can't protect rights if too many decisions are made by simple majorities, because you can have a situation where simple majorities simply reduce the number of people who can vote against them until their power is overwhelming. Or worse, by the pluralities of those voting. Not everyone is required to vote. If only 5% of the people vote, and half of those want something, is what they want really legitimate? So, by setting up a blocking mechanism, we can ensure that in order to prevail, a supermajority needs to assemble a large enough coalition to overcome the blocking minority. And in the process, to organize deliberation in a way that may cause the whole bunch to decide that it wasn't such a good idea after all. So, majorities can be constructed of rent seekers. You get a little government benefit to this group, a little government benefit to that group. Before you know, you've got a majority who are beneficiaries of government and who may decide to vote for more benefits, but to do so in a way that ultimately brings the whole thing crashing down. And in fact, the current debate we have on the subject is not a new situation. There have been many historical examples of republics or democracies where this situation has developed, and every single one of them failed. It usually devolved into a tyranny of some kind of dictatorship, a monarchy. So a well-designed constitution provides for blocking actions by minorities until a consensus can be developed. And sometimes inaction is better. It's easy for people to get excited and say, oh, we've got to do something. Well, sometimes it's better not to do anything. An old saying of mine is, I have the ultimate solution to all problems. Do nothing for 5 billion years. The problem takes care of itself. A republic presumes a marketplace. Now, this point, it may be controversial. Can't you have a republic in a communistic system where nobody owns any private property? Well, I don't think so, because there's no effective mechanism to prevent rights from being violated if people don't have private property. At least no way that anyone has discovered. But a free market, the ideal free market, is never fully realized, and if it's approached, it's metastable. Now, in physics, we speak of something being metastable if there's a kind of potential curve that forms a peak with a little dip at the top. Then it falls off again. So if something is in that little dip right near the top, it can jiggle around, it can be perturbed and stay there. But if it's perturbed too much, it goes over the edge and all the way down the slope. That's the situation we describe as metastable. And the free market has 3 major threats. First is unchecked government, because with the public choice problem, government can interfere with the market until everybody's mainly benefiting by the political process instead of the market process. It can be threatened by unchecked speculative investment. It's not really true that government creates depressions or the business cycle. It can encourage them. The main way it encourages them is by preventing crashes from occurring more often than they do. By postponing the inevitable day of the crash, the result is almost always a worse crash. But it's very hard, especially for a government that's accountable to the voters, to avoid letting it crash, to just let it crash. And nobody wants to be blamed for it crashing on his watch. However, there is also no natural way to prevent speculators from running amok. We've seen speculative investment throughout history, thousands of years of examples, and generally it all ends badly. But people eventually recover. The third way is, of course, war or civil conflict, which of course may be the result of the first two. So to avoid this, at least for the government part of it, it requires constitutional devotion to restrain government and money. So far, the only way that I have found in all of my study of history to deal with speculative investment is through Shmita, which I've mentioned on a previous occasion. That's an ancient Hebrew law. It's actually split between two different parts of the Torah, but which calls for a 7-year cycle of the cancellation of debts and letting the fields lie fallow. In other words, no agricultural production for a whole year. Now, if that were carried into the future, that would probably have to include production generally and investment generally. So if we had an orderly 7-year cycle for investment and production, where we essentially ended everything for 1 year every 7 years, it would prevent catastrophic collapses by scheduling a collapse, small collapse, every 7 years, which people could plan for. But when it's allowed to proceed beyond control, then you can get a situation like we did in the 30s, which led to a world war, to more than 100 million dead. And fortunately, nuclear weapons were only introduced at the end of the war by one of the combatants, because if they had had nuclear weapons at the beginning of the war, the chances are that the death toll would have been far, far higher. And now we have at least 8 nations that publicly proclaim that they are nuclear capable. North Korea says it is, but we have doubts. We have another 20 who could build a nuclear weapon within a few months if they really wanted to. If things really fall apart, how likely is it that we're going to avoid nuclear Armageddon? So the stakes are very high. So, a constitutional order can have dysfunction. There can be mistakes in the original Constitution. There can be omissions from it, ambiguities, but then there can also be a loss of devotion to it, a loss of understanding of it, reliance interests supporting non-compliance. Now, reliance interests are those that when a deviation from fidelity occurs, invest themselves, their careers, their money, whatever, in the new state of affairs and come to rely on a continuation of that deviation. If we were to return to strict compliance today, there were a lot of people whose careers would be ended and who would lose all their money. So naturally, they're going to oppose it. Uh, the dysfunction can be caused by unmanageably large and complex government. Of course, that's also true of unmanageably large and complex corporations or any other organization. There comes a point when it gets so large, it's not just too big to fail, but too big to understand. Too big to intelligently make decisions about. So we can have unmanageable problems, not just organizational problems, but fundamental problems that require us to be smarter, to have information that we don't have or don't know how to use if we did. The universe is not organized for our comfort and convenience, and sometimes we're faced with a situation where we just don't have what it takes. Now, there are many remedies, if at least at the constitutional level and in the legal system, if things aren't working properly. We can adopt constitutional amendments. We may have to. If court precedents have deviated from the Constitution far enough and long enough, there may be no good way to turn back to strict compliance just by seeking court decisions. Because even if you replace all the members of Congress and the guy in the White House, started appointing a whole new set of judges, anybody you appoint to replace the ones you've got is still going to feel bound to all those precedents. It could take 60 years, 3 generations, to get those precedents overturned by a normal process of litigation. And many billions and multiple billions of dollars in costs. It's extremely expensive to do that. Statutes can clarify the Constitution in the sense that they can avoid deviating from it, and where there are ambiguities, they can provide clarifications. Of course, you can have elections that replace the public officials and the appointments of different judges or administrators. You can have court decisions, but again, there's a difficulty in overcoming this monumental legacy. The Civil War amendments were essentially adopted because it felt there was no effective way to overturn the decades of bad precedents that had led up to the Civil War, like Dred Scott and Barron v. Baltimore. It felt the only way we can turn back these bad precedents is to adopt amendments. We can have juries, but juries can only function as a blocking action, or as they can prevent convictions in criminal cases. They can also prevent, of course, prosecutions, civil complaints where the government is a plaintiff. Public education is important, but we'll get to later why that's a difficulty in itself. We can organize public pressure, but anyone who's been involved in trying to organize public pressure knows that in today's civic climate, it's very hard to get enough people to coalesce around a few key leaders. And when they do, it's often the wrong leaders. But leadership is critical. If you don't have leaders that people will follow, then you're not going to be able to get anything else done. So, this of course, it can be considered controversial, but every generation thinks that its cohorts have declined in civic virtue. We may debate that, but the argument is that people are too prosperous and complacent, that they've got something that they don't want to lose, so they don't want to rock the boat. They're distracted by making a living. Remember, when this country was founded, we were an agrarian cycle, most people didn't work very hard during summer and winter. Most of work was done during spring planting and autumn harvesting season. So you'll notice that the Constitutional Convention was held during the summer. The reason for that, because at the end of that period they had to get to work, go home and make some money. But we're no longer on an agrarian cycle. We're on a mercantile schedule, which means working 24/7. People today are distracted by entertainments. We didn't have television in the founding era. In fact, the main entertainment was conversation. And what did you talk about? Politics. So there's also complaints that we don't motivate children to become educated. Now, I had a personal experience with that as a substitute teacher. The level and kind of motivation of kids to become educated is not the same now as it was when I was a kid. When I was a kid, almost everyone, even the dumb students, wanted to be educated. They wanted to learn. They were eager. They came to class every day wanting to learn. They did their reading assignments. They did their homework. Oh yeah, there were a few exceptions. You know, some guys would slack off. But by and large, everyone expected them to excel. And they bought into that expectation. Their parents, the community, everybody. And academic achievement was considered the prime status symbol, not athletic achievement. That was beginning to emerge and become more important. But by and large, academic performance was the primary basis for which status was conferred. Now we have education that tends to neglect civics. And having watched it directly, I can have seen how that has occurred. Mm-hmm. American history and government, it isn't even taught for the founding era past the age of the 8th grade for non-AP students in Texas. It's taught in the junior high years when nobody seems to be disposed to learn anything. And as my grandfather pointed out, who taught in the era of the one-room schoolhouse, and later in the era of students organized into classes by age, he felt that organizing students into classes by age tended to put them too much under the influence of other students and not enough under the influence of adults, so that they were graduating but with adolescent values instead of adult values. And he was afraid we would wind up with a nation of adolescents. There's been a loss of community organizing. Remember, de Tocqueville wrote about how in America that he visited in the 1840s that everybody was a member of multiple civic associations. Everybody was organized, many organizations. Everywhere you looked, organizations. Churches, civic groups, almost anything issue of the day had an organization and built up around it. A few years ago, a guy wrote a book which examined bowling leagues. It's called Bowling Alone, and he pointed out that it's very hard now to put together a bowling league because people are atomized into individuals or nuclear families. They don't, this urge to organize civically has declined dramatically, and it can be measured by looking at things like bowling leagues and other civic enterprises. That's not to say that there are not civic organizations that are still active, but now they are mainly comprised of a minority of the citizenry. They used to be almost everybody. And this is related to the fragmentation of families. I noted in my own family. one generation, extended family in Texas, 4 generations, all living within with a mile or so of each other. World War II happened. A whole bunch of the scattered went off to other parts looking for work. Most never returned. Grandmother held the family together until she died, and after that it never really came together again. And the number of kids per generation fell from 7 to about 4 to about 2 to less than 1. And of course we have another thing which we can consider controversial, the culture of deception. Now we've always had a culture of deception, but there are differences, because there used to be deception was mainly perpetrated by private parties, and now we have government that considers it okay to lie to the people in a way that it didn't used to be considered acceptable. Now, this is sort of an odd slide here, but this gets into the problem of what too often happens when people have ideas for reform. People will demand that somebody do something on some problem, and somebody will come along and says, I've got a solution. And he comes up with a clever proposal that won't work and will make matters even worse, and then sells it to all these guys like snake oil and saying, support me, send money, get up and rally, this is the solution to all of our problems. Well, people are all too willing to leave the details to others, many of whom are not really on their side. I call them poison pill proposals because in government, law, legislation, business, a proposal that is designed to defeat the purpose of the ostensible purpose of the proposal is called a poison pill. There can also be clauses in contracts of senior executives such that if the company is taken over and the new company tries to terminate them, they wind up having to pay them a lot of money.
That's a golden parachute, not a poison pill.
Well, actually that is golden parachute, but there are also similar clauses that have the effect of making the deal a lot less attractive, perhaps after it's too late to get back out of it. One form of this are the patriot myths about law. All those elites have their own myths. And it's a little hard to tell sometimes who's the most prone to myth making. Without investing in legal self-education, people don't know whom to believe. And poison pills often absorb reformer resources, disappoint and cause them to drop out. So if anyone is an impulse to reform something, they need to be aware of the enemy within. So we have the problem of constitutional apostasy. The Constitution is not perfect. It was intended to be amended more often than it has been. But amendment is difficult. So too many have just drifted away from original understanding in their practices. It's easier to just violate it, and as Admiral Grace Hopper once said, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. And then pretend that the Constitution supports them. But that pretense is becoming unsustainable. Most reliance interests now, at least the more intelligent advocates, are actually no longer pretending to be compatible with original understanding. I debate with these guys almost every day. Mainly lawyers, some historians, other legal scholars. And there's an increasing realization that, yeah, this policy is unconstitutional, but so what? What we want is a living constitution that lets us do whatever we want. So we had an election, we won it. Isn't that an amendment to the Constitution? However, if practices lose their tether to the Constitution, they can become inconsistent, not only with the Constitution, but with each other. The rule of law does not permit contradictions. If you allow one contradiction in a logical system, you allow them all. It's an important principle of logic. If you allow a single contradiction, then the truth value of all propositions becomes indeterminate. Everything can be both true and false at the same time, and there's no basis for deciding what is right or just or legal or anything else. So, decisions, if there are contradictions allowed, become politics rather than law, based not upon rule or a rule of law, but on connections, who you know, how much money they've donated, whatever. But politics itself requires some rules to avoid anarchy. A lot of these reliance interests that want a broad interpretation of some constitutional power will nevertheless recoil at an interpretation that would essentially cause the whole system to stop working even for their benefit. So they're trying to play a buffet and say, okay, I will like this provision and that provision, but not that provision and that provision. But if it's one document, one law, that selectivity is not sustainable. So we need to find and resolve the contradictions, which will involve rediscovery of original meaning. Reliance interests, back to them, are called rent seekers by economists, are examined in public choice theory. Some discover they can make more money through the political process than in the market, just as they can by speculating in financial instruments instead of making things, especially financial instruments that they don't understand themselves. And that's our present situation. The result is a bubble of government and of the financial sector. And bubbles burst, and this one can bring starvation. So are the preppers right? About economic collapse, generally, yes. But preparing for that requires places in the country. The cities are likely to become unlivable if things get as bad as some of us think. And substantial resources, even in the country. Living off the land is not as easy as it might sound. Most can prepare for a few weeks, but if things get as bad as we think they are likely to, it could be years or decades. They need to be able to organize for mutual defense, and there's no real solution for individuals or small groups. Minimum defensible community would probably be several hundred. But even the elites in bunkers probably can't hold out long enough. If you're watching Jesse Ventura lately, he did a tour of an underground bunker being built in the Ozarks. It's under construction. He actually was able to drive in and film it. You know, miles and miles and miles of underground tunnels.
Where can you see them?
It's on the True TV channel.
Which one?
True TV, I think. It'll be on again. It's also on YouTube and other things.
Who's building it?
It's being built by the government. And there's also a private house being built on top of the whole thing that looks like a fortress, seemingly owned by the CEO of the company that makes surveillance satellites. A former CIA operative. Okay, there's also a similar bunker in western Colorado. So, you know, the elites seem to be preparing to survive a debacle, but my sense of it is they're probably not prepared to hold off for more than 5 or 10 years, and that may not be enough. So, my focus is in the aftermath. I don't think that disaster is avoidable. But if we're not going to yield to an Orwellian nightmare, we need to be preparing for coming out of the other side of the great unraveling in some kind of decent order. At least a few of us. That means a constitutional order and not just strongmen. That doesn't mean that some men aren't going to have to be strong, but we hope that the ones that appear will be in favor of a constitutional order. The Constitution we have is actually okay with some clarifications, but we're going to need to rebuild devotion to it from the bottom up to make sure that the survivors are devoted to it. Because I'm afraid that most of the ones who are devoted to it now probably aren't going to survive. And to prepare the people to carry it out.